There's something profoundly unsettling for people when you choose to walk away without saying a word. Not because silence is loud, but because it's final. It's not wrapped in explanation or softened by closure. It just is. And for those who are used to having the upper hand, who relied on your emotional responses to feed their ego, their need for relevance, your silence becomes deafening. It becomes the kind of unanswered question that they can't escape, that follows them long after you're gone. People expect endings to be dramatic. They expect shouting, crying, accusation, some kind of emotional eruption they can react to, defend against, or twist in their favor. They expect the kind of goodbye that gives them a foothold to stay in your life, even if it's only through guilt or confusion. When you take that away from them, when you choose to exit without offering them a chance to narrate the ending, it forces them to sit with themselves. And for a lot of people, especially the ones who thrived on your vulnerability, that's terrifying. There's a difference between walking away out of weakness and walking away in quiet strength. When you stop explaining yourself, when you stop justifying your boundaries or trying to be understood, you're not giving up, you're rising above. You're stepping outside the loop of chaos and emotional manipulation. That's why silence, when it comes from healing, is so powerful. It doesn't scream, it doesn't beg, it simply leaves. And it says more than any final conversation ever could. See, when you say goodbye with words, there's still an exchange happening. There's still a tether that exists, even if it's fragile. But when you walk away without warning, without ceremony, you remove the stage. You deny them the spotlight. You don't give them a chance to paint themselves as the victim or as the misunderstood one. You eliminate the theater, and in doing so, you create something far more disturbing to them, a vacuum, and a vacuum doesn't echo with your pain, it reflects their own emptiness. That's what makes quiet endings so rare and so effective, because they don't validate the ego of the one who wronged you, they don't allow for drama or damage control, they just end. And while that might not seem satisfying in the moment, over time it proves to be one of the clearest declarations of self-respect you can make. It's the moment you say, not out loud, but through action, I don't need this anymore, I don't need you anymore. People who have taken you for granted often rely on the belief that you'll always need closure, that you'll always reach out one more time, that you'll want answers, or that you'll need to explain why you're done. But when you choose to go without saying goodbye, you strip that expectation away. You become an unanswered question in their life, not the other way around. And that changes everything, because now they're the one wondering what happened. They're the one replaying every moment, looking for clues, hoping for some kind of sign that they still matter. And they might reach out not because they've changed, but because they want to know if you still need them. They want to confirm that the door is still cracked open. But the silence denies them that comfort. It denies them the illusion that they're still in control. And whether they admit it or not, that silence is going to echo in their mind for a long, long time, because there's no script for what to do when someone you thought would never leave just vanishes. Of course, this kind of silence has to come from the right place. It can't be a strategy, it can't be a performance. It has to come from a place of real clarity, a place where you're no longer trying to prove anything, not to them and not to yourself. It has to come from a decision to value peace over vindication, growth over closure. And when it does, it becomes the loudest goodbye you'll ever give. Because you're not just letting go of them, you're letting go of the part of you that needed them. You're letting go of the part that waited for recognition or apology or understanding. And in its place, you're building a new foundation, one that doesn't depend on anyone else's validation to stand tall. So what happens when you let go without saying goodbye? You end the story on your own terms, not theirs, not pains, not chaoses. And that silence is where your power finally begins. You don't need to say goodbye when your emotions have already detached. People think that the end of a relationship happens in a single conversation, a dramatic moment or some final act, but it doesn't. It ends long before that. It ends in all the little moments when you stop reacting, when you stop caring the way you used to, when the things they say no longer spark anything in you. not anger, not hope, not even pain, just silence. Emotional detachment is the quietest and most powerful form of closure because it means that what once had the power to move you no longer does. You're no longer waiting for a call that doesn't come. You're no longer watching what they post, reading between the lines, wondering what it all means. You're just done. And not in a way that's filled with resentment or bitterness, but in a way that feels peaceful. That's when you know the goodbye already happened internally. And that's why they panic, because they can feel it even if you're still in the same room, even if you're still answering messages or showing up in the same spaces. They can sense the distance. That emotional wall is unmistakable. It's not coldness, it's clarity. And clarity is the one thing manipulative people fear the most. Because when you're clear, you don't play anymore. You don't chase, you don't beg, you don't explain yourself for the 100th time. You observe, you move, you decide. They notice it in your eyes first. That spark they once had control over is gone. The way you used to look at them with expectation or emotion, it's missing now. There's no emotional leverage left. And that's when the dynamic begins to shift. They lose their grip, not because you shouted or slammed the door, but because you stopped needing them to understand anything. You stopped needing them to be someone they were never going to be. You start to realize that peace is more valuable than being heard, that walking away emotionally means no more power games, no more cycles, no more rehearsed apologies followed by repeated betrayals. It means that you've reached a level of self-respect that can't be shaken. And the irony is they often start acting right when it's already too late. Not because they care in the way you once hoped they would, but because they can't stand being irrelevant to you. When you're emotionally attached, even in conflict, they feel secure. Because the anger, the frustration, the sadness, all of it means they still matter. But when you're detached, it's like you've unplugged from the source. They're performing, but the audience has left, and it hits them in a way they didn't prepare for. Because the silence isn't just about what you're not saying, it's about what you no longer feel. There's a kind of power that comes when you don't react anymore. When they try to provoke you and you just go bite, when they throw out bait, jealousy, silence, guilt, and it doesn't move you, that's when they realize the connection is broken. And it wasn't a conversation that did it, it was your internal shift. It was you deciding that your energy is too sacred to be wasted on someone who doesn't know how to receive it. And so they test. They test to see if there's still something left in you to manipulate. They might say something provocative, try to guilt you into caring, even beg, but none of it works anymore because you're not emotionally dependent on their behavior. You're no longer orbiting their approval. You're not playing the same game they're still stuck in. And that's the beginning of true freedom. When you reach that stage, you don't need a grand goodbye. You don't need to type out paragraphs explaining your growth or detailing every hurt. That was the old you, the one still trying to make sense of why they couldn't love you right. But the healed version of you knows that letting go isn't about teaching them a lesson. It's about protecting your peace. It's not about making them understand. It's about knowing that understanding doesn't change outcome. Behavior does. And when the emotions are gone, so is their access. They only had influence because you cared, because you believed, hoped, invested. But now that emotional bridge is gone, and without it, they can't reach you, not really, not with words, not with gestures, not with apologies that come too late. They're talking to a version of you that no longer exists. So you don't say goodbye, because there's nothing left to say. You already left the moment your heart stopped waiting. When you let go without saying goodbye, you're not just walking away from someone, you're walking back toward yourself. You're reclaiming the parts of you that were lost in the process of trying to hold something together that was never meant to last. And what often surprises people is how quickly they notice the absence, not of your presence, but of your energy. Because for a long time, you were carrying more than your share. You were investing, showing up, fixing, explaining, accommodating. You were the emotional weight bearer. And once you stopped, they feel it deeply. Most people don't realize how much they depended on your willingness to carry the emotional burden. They mistook your effort for obligation. They thought you'd never leave because you hadn't yet. But letting go doesn't always come with a warning. It often arrives in stillness and silence, not because you don't care anymore, but because you finally care enough about yourself to stop bleeding for someone who never noticed the wound they caused. And that's when the panic sets in for them. Because your absence becomes undeniable. You're no longer reacting. You're no longer emotionally available to their patterns. They might not say it out loud, but they begin to unravel, not because they've suddenly changed or because they're overwhelmed with remorse, but because they lost the control that came from your emotional engagement. They relied on your softness, your understanding, your empathy. It was always there until it wasn't. See, most people don't panic when you say you're going to leave. They panic when you no longer try to stay. And when you don't give a formal goodbye, when you don't offer a final conversation to give them a sense of closure or understanding, they're left with a silence they can't decode. That uncertainty drives them crazy because they're used to you filling in the blanks, explaining your every move, giving them the reassurance they never truly earned. But now you're different, you're grounded, you're no longer explaining. And in that shift, they lose access to the version of you that was easy to manipulate, the one who would bend over backwards to avoid conflict, the one who would take the blame just to keep the peace, the one who'd come back again and again because you believed love meant enduring whatever came your way. The reason they panic is simple. Their reflection disappears when you leave. They only saw themselves clearly through your eyes. Your admiration, your validation, your devotion, that was their mirror. And now without it, they're forced to face what they truly are. And it's uncomfortable. Because they were never interested in growing with you. They were interested in being adored without accountability. They wanted the benefits of your loyalty without the burden of matching it. And now they realize too late that your silence is louder than any goodbye ever could be. It echoes. It forces them to confront the consequences of their behavior. Because now they have to sit in it with no rescue, no fix, no soft place to land, just space. And that space reveals everything they never wanted to see. The damage, the manipulation, the selfishness, the lies they told themselves about who they were in the relationship. This kind of letting go isn't cold-hearted, it's deeply self-awareness. It comes from exhaustion, not resentment. You loved with everything you had. You tried every path back to understanding. But there comes a moment when you realize that your healing can't wait for their awakening. That your life, your peace, your sanity, these things are too valuable to keep sacrificing. So you retreat quietly, without theatrics, without a final message, without one more attempt to be understood. You take your energy back, your focus, your heart, and while they might interpret that as indifference, it's actually the highest form of self-respect. Because you've stopped trying to get closure from someone who wasn't capable of giving it. You've created your own. And make no mistake, they feel it. They check your social media, they linger in places they hope you'll appear, they bring you up in conversations, even indirectly, because they're trying to piece together why the game ended when they didn't expect it to. And the truth is, it ended the moment you stopped making excuses for their behavior and started making space for your peace. You didn't need a dramatic exit, you needed a quiet return to yourself. That's why it's so powerful. Because it wasn't about punishing them, it was about liberating you. And sometimes the most transformative thing you can do isn't yelling or explaining or fighting one last time. It's walking away without a sound, knowing that your silence will say everything your words never could. And so you leave not with noise, but with clarity. When you let go without saying goodbye, what you're doing consciously or not is removing a safety net they never thought would vanish. It's not just your absence that disrupts them. It's the loss of their emotional insurance policy. For a long time, they took for granted that no matter how distant they grew, how careless they acted, how inconsistent their efforts were, you'd always be there. They believed they could leave the door half open and you'd never walk out. They relied on the fact that you always gave closure, always gave understanding, always gave a piece of yourself to help them feel complete. But then you stop. You step back, not out of spite, but out of survival. and they don't know how to process it. Because the thing about people who depend on your emotional labor is this: they rarely understand how much you did for them until you stop. They confuse your tolerance for weakness. Your compassion becomes their crutch. And once you remove it, the entire structure of the relationship crumbles. They're left with themselves, their own voice, their own emptiness. That's what they fear most. And that's why they chase closure. Not because they want peace, but because they want relief from the discomfort of accountability. You have to understand something deeply unsettling but fundamentally true. Some people only keep others around to avoid dealing with their own reflection. Your presence gave them a distraction from their own emotional gaps. Your emotional investment covered up the void they refused to confront. So when you leave, especially without a clear explanation, they're not just reacting to the loss of you, they're reacting to the loss of the illusion they built using your energy. Now they start reaching out. Or maybe they don't. Maybe their pride keeps them silent. But inside, there's a panic, a restless anxiety, because the old tactics no longer work. They can't guilt you. They can't bait you. They can't pull on the strings they used to manipulate. You're not responding to breadcrumbs anymore. You're not orbiting them emotionally, waiting for signs of effort. You've become immune to the pattern. And that immunity, it terrifies them. There's something uniquely powerful about emotional detachment that wasn't broadcasted. You didn't make a show of walking away. You didn't send a long message listing everything you tolerated. You just stopped participating. And that quiet withdrawal has far more impact than any loud goodbye ever could. Because they can't argue with silence. They can't twist your words or rewrite your narrative. There's nothing to manipulate, just absence. And absence has a strange way of reflecting truth. That's when they start replaying everything. Not because they miss you the way you missed them, but because they missed the version of themselves they could only access when you were around. You made them feel valuable, admired, supported. You gave them a sense of identity, of meaning. And now they're disoriented because they thought they were the strong one. They thought you needed them, but it turns out you were the glue, the anchor, the foundation. And now without you, they see how unstable their structure always was. That realization doesn't come in a flash. It creeps in slowly, maybe in the silence of the night, maybe in the quiet of familiar places where your laughter used to live, maybe in moments when they reach for their phone to message you and realize they've already lost the right to your attention. And still, they won't always admit it. They'll pretend they're fine. They'll mask the panic with distractions, with denial, but the truth lingers beneath it all. They didn't expect you to let go without warning. You've changed now. You're not looking back, and you're not leaving breadcrumbs either. You're not trying to make them miss you. You're not hoping they come running. You're walking forward, not away from them, but toward who you were meant to be before you forgot yourself trying to be everything for someone else. That shift, it's internal, but it radiates outward. And they can feel it. That's why sometimes letting go without goodbye is the most honest thing you can do. Not because you're heartless, but because you've finally honored your worth. Because you've learned that closure isn't something they give you. It's something you give yourself when you realize your peace matters more than being understood by someone who is never truly listening. You leave not because it was easy, but because staying had slowly become self-abandonment. And in that decision, in that silent but profound reclaiming of your energy, they come face to face with a version of you they never thought would emerge. The version that doesn't need them anymore. When you let go without saying goodbye, it strips away the last piece of control they thought they had over you. See, a lot of people operate with this unspoken assumption that as long as they leave things unresolved, as long as they don't close the door all the way, you will hesitate to walk out for good. That hesitation is what they depend on. That uncertainty is what keeps you orbiting them, emotionally tethered, even when the relationship itself is crumbling. But once you leave quietly, without drama, without fanfare, it delivers a message that cuts far deeper than any argument or declaration ever could. It says, you've decided your own peace matters more than their understanding. And that shakes them. What people don't realize is that silence can be louder than confrontation. When you don't give someone a final message to manipulate or an emotional scene to feed off of, you leave them with the one thing they fear most, your absence and their own thoughts. The ability to twist your words, to paint themselves as the victim, to provoke you into explaining yourself. Those are tools that suddenly disappear when you walk away without closure. You're not giving them a playbook, you're not giving them fuel, you're just gone. And that kind of void can't be controlled, it has to be felt. Now think about that. Think about how many times you've stayed in something toxic because you thought you owed someone an explanation. Think about how often you tried to leave gently, kindly, compassionately, only to be dragged back in by guilt or manipulation or a performance of vulnerability. That cycle happens when you underestimate the length some people will go to keep you hooked. Not because they love you, but because your presence makes their life easier, to cushion their insecurities. You validate their behavior. You make them feel less alone without requiring them to grow. So when you finally see through that pattern and leave without a word, it's not just rejection, it's exposure. You've exposed the imbalance, you've exposed the emotional dependency, and in doing so, you force them to reckon with a version of themselves they'd rather avoid. No distractions, no excuses, just the consequences of their own behavior. That's not cruelty. That's clarity. That's what happens when someone chooses not to play a game anymore. There's a certain power in being done quietly, a calm finality. It's not reactive, and it's not vindictive. It's simply the outcome of understanding your value. You're not punishing them by leaving in silence. You're preserving yourself. And that distinction matters, because for so long they trained you to believe that strength looks like tolerance, that love looks like endurance, that kindness means never walking away first, but those are lies. Real strength is knowing when enough is enough, even if it makes you look cold to someone who only warmed themselves by your fire and never offered their own. Eventually, they will begin to wonder why you didn't say goodbye, why you didn't explain yourself, why you didn't leave the door open just a little. That's when the realization sets in, that maybe you were stronger than they thought, that maybe you saw through the performance, that maybe, just maybe, you didn't need closure from them because you'd already made peace within yourself. And that, more than anything else, will disturb them, because the one thing they never expected was for you to find freedom in the very silence they used to fear. People like that, who depend on emotional chaos to stay relevant, don't understand what it means when someone finds peace. And they certainly don't know how to deal with it when the peace comes from detaching from them, because their influence doesn't stretch that far anymore. Their presence no longer dictates your mood. You don't flinch when they post something meant to get your attention. You don't react. You don't respond. You don't play. And that shift, it's not just behavioral, it's spiritual. You've severed a bond they thought was unbreakable. You've done something few people have the courage to do. You walked away without needing to be seen doing it. And in that moment, you reclaim all the parts of yourself you lost, trying to be understood by someone who only ever listened to argue. You no longer crave their apology. You no longer seek their remorse. Because you've learned that some people won't give you closure simply because they benefit from your confusion. But once you understand that truth, once you embrace it, you're no longer trapped by it. That's why when you leave without goodbye, you don't just end a relationship, you end a pattern. You end the story where you're always the one trying to make things right. And you begin a new one where your silence speaks not of defeat but of evolution. And that silence, that resolute, unapologetic silence, becomes your liberation. There's something remarkably unsettling to someone when they realize they can no longer access your emotional energy. When you finally walk away without looking back, without pleading, without needing to be heard, there's a kind of finality in that silence that rattles them far more than any argument or goodbye ever could, especially when it comes from someone who used to be emotionally invested, responsive, reactive. Because what you're showing in that moment is that they've lost the ability to pull a reaction from you. And that realization isn't just disappointing, it's destabilizing. People who manipulate or control others through emotional tactics thrive on engagement. They don't always need you to love them or even like them. Sometimes they just need you to respond. That response is proof that they still matter in your world, that they still hold space in your mind. But once that response is gone, once they met with indifference rather than anger, calm instead of conflict, they're confronted with something they can't influence, your inner peace. And nothing strips power from a manipulator faster than someone who no longer needs to be understood or validated by them. So when you leave without saying goodbye and you stay gone, emotionally gone, mentally gone, spiritually gone, that sends a much deeper message than any goodbye could. It says, I don't need to explain myself to you anymore. I'm not interested in fixing what's already broken. I'm not coming back, and I don't need you to follow. That kind of departure doesn't invite closure, it declares it. You have to understand that some people rely on the open door. They don't walk away themselves, but they also don't want you to close the door on them. They want to linger. They want to check in when it suits them, stir things up when they're bored, and disappear again when they've gotten what they need. That dynamic can only exist if you leave the door cracked open, emotionally or otherwise. But when you don't say goodbye, when you just walk through that door and shut it quietly, firmly, finally, it's not just confusing to them, it's infuriating. Because now they have to live with the fact that the power dynamic has changed. You're no longer seeking resolution, you're not stuck in the loop, and you're not replaying conversations in your mind wondering what you could have done differently. You're done. And what people like that never prepared for is the version of you that's truly finished. They prepared for tears, for emotional breakdowns, for regret, but not for stillness, not for composure, not for silence that can't be pierced. And it's in that silence that they begin to feel the weight of what they've lost. Maybe not because they miss you, though they might, but more often because they miss the control. They miss the convenience of you always being there. The comfort of knowing you would respond if they reached out, even if it was just to argue. But now, they don't even have that. They are left with their own reflection. And it's in that space of quiet where they begin to feel what they tried so hard to avoid, the consequences of their own behavior. You become a mirror, not by showing them who they are, but by showing them who you're no longer willing to be for them. You're no longer the person who explains yourself endlessly, who tries to fix what can't be fixed, who offers compassion to someone who sees it as a weakness. You're not that anymore. And once you stop playing that role, they have to reckon with their part in why you left in the first place. I think that's a brutal realization for someone who thought you'd always stay. And here's the thing, your silence isn't meant to hurt them. It's not meant to punish or get revenge. It's simply a natural outcome of healing. When you begin to value your peace more than your need to be understood, you stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who is blind to it. You realize that your energy is sacred, and not everyone is entitled to it just because they once had access to it. That's why when you walk away without goodbye, what you're really doing is reclaiming your dignity. You're letting your actions speak louder than your words ever could, and in doing so, you're teaching others, without saying a single thing, what your boundaries are, what your standards are, what you will and will not accept anymore. That doesn't just change the dynamic with them, it changes the way you relate to everyone from that point forward. So when they find themselves sitting with the silence, wondering why you didn't say goodbye, they won't be able to avoid the deeper truth that maybe you outgrew the conversation. Maybe you outgrew the relationship. Maybe you finally chose yourself, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in a quiet, unwavering one. And that kind of choice, that kind of departure, echoes far longer than any final words ever could. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all.